The heat wakes you before the sun does. You're on a mud brick roof somewhere in the Nile Delta, the air already thick with river water and something baking in the dark below. Silt and warm bread, that's what ancient Egypt smelled like, at least for the people who actually lived here. You are not a pharaoh. Nobody is coming to dress you. Your hands are rough and your day starts now. This civilization lasted 3,000 years. It built monuments that modern engineers still can't fully explain. The pyramids at Giza were already ancient to Cleopatra, the way Cleopatra is ancient to us. And the people who kept this world running, who mixed the mortar, planted the grain, raised the children, and prayed each morning to gods we can barely name now, almost none of them appear in the history books. Most Egyptians never set foot inside a pyramid. They lived in mud brick towns beside the river, working before the heat turned dangerous, eating bread every day of their lives, and preparing, from a surprisingly young age, for what came after. This is their story. If that's the kind of history that brought you here, subscribing is the best way to say so. The house you're waking up in is made of mud. Not crudely, the ancient Egyptians were not improvising. Adobe bricks, shaped from Nile silt mixed with straw and dried hard under the sun, were the primary building material across nearly the entire civilization, from the poorest fishing village to the courtyard walls of wealthy estates. Stone was reserved for temples and tombs, the things that needed to outlast everyone. Houses were for the living, and the living apparently didn't warrant stone. What they got instead was surprisingly functional. A typical peasant home in a Nile town was 2 or 3 stories tall, narrow, and packed close to its neighbors, built on the strip of habitable ground between the river and the desert. The ground floor wasn't really a home at all. It was workspace, storage, sometimes a small shop open to the street. The family lived above it. They cooked, ate, slept, and argued upstairs in rooms that were dark and relatively cool, with small windows covered by woven mats to keep out insects. The mats kept out flies. They kept out some of the heat. They didn't keep out much else. The flat roof, though, was the real prize. In summer, when the interior of a mud brick room turned into something approaching an oven, and in Egypt it did this every single summer, families dragged their sleeping mats up top. Open sky, whatever breeze the night could offer, and the distant sound of the river somewhere below. Sleeping outside wasn't rustic or desperate, it was just sense. If you were wealthier, a scribe, a senior priest, a merchant who'd accumulated enough grain surplus to build on, your house reflected it. Not just in size, but in organization. A reception area near the entrance for guests and business. A taller central hall with more air moving through it. Private quarters set further back, separated from where strangers came and went. Some of the more prosperous households had enclosed courtyards with shade trees planted deliberately against the heat. A green and quiet interior that the street outside couldn't offer. The wealthiest had what you might call a spatial logic to the whole thing, a hierarchy built into the floor plan, making perfectly clear who was welcome in which room and who was expected to stay near the door. Most Egyptians stayed near the door, metaphorically speaking. Peasants made up roughly 80% of the population. The entire machine of the civilization, the temples, the monuments, the elaborate theology, the military ambitions, the court rituals that required whole armies of servants, ran on their labor. And what they came home to after a day in the fields was a few small rooms, mud walls, and a mat on the floor. Inside those walls, though, something interesting. The Egyptians decorated everything. Even modest homes had painted interiors, geometric patterns, scenes from nature, bands of color across walls that were otherwise dim and plain. Not necessarily sophisticated, but never absent. The impulse to make a space feel inhabited rather than merely occupied seemed to cut across every level of Egyptian society. Furniture was a different story. Chairs, proper beds with wooden frames, tables, those belonged to the wealthy. Ordinary families sat on the floor, slept on reed mats, stored their belongings in clay pots or baskets woven from palm fronds. The archaeological record at excavated worker villages makes this divide fairly clear. The rich had objects, the poor had space. Every home, regardless of size, had a shrine. Not an elaborate one, a niche in the wall, a painted image, maybe a small clay figure of a protective deity that could be spoken to when things went sideways. Bess appeared in household shrines across the entire social spectrum, a dwarf deity with a lion's mane and a face that sits somewhere between unsettling and almost funny, responsible for protecting families, especially young children and women in labor. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, watched over pregnancy and birth. Both looked monstrous by any conventional standard. Both were deeply beloved across every stratum of Egyptian society. The Egyptians understood, apparently, that the things capable of protecting you don't always look safe. Underneath all of this, the brickwork, the painted walls, the household shrines, was a problem that never went away. The Nile, the river, was everything. The source of the soil, the water, the food supply, the agricultural calendar that structured the entire year. But it also flooded every year, reliably and dramatically. The inundation season, Akhet, covered the fields with water and silt, then retreated and left behind the rich black earth that made Egyptian farming so extraordinarily productive. Without the flood, there was no Egypt. Everyone knew this. The flood was a gift, celebrated and prayed for. It was also sometimes a catastrophe. You built your home on the narrow habitable band above the flood line, too close to the river and the water would eventually take it, too far back and you were building on desert ground where nothing grew. The margin was not generous. A particularly high inundation could reach houses that had stood safely for decades. And mud brick, for all its virtues in dry heat, dissolved in prolonged contact with water. Walls softened, foundations shifted, roofs came apart. Some settlements were abandoned, rebuilt slightly higher and gradually forgotten. Some were simply swallowed. This is the world most Egyptians move through every day of their lives, cramped and colorful, practical and intensely religious, with gods tucked into corners of rooms too small to hold much else. Physically fragile in ways the stone monuments were specifically designed to deny, the monuments were built to outlast everything. The homes were built to last a lifetime, maybe two, and then the river would make its decision. Every morning, the people inside those homes woke up early before the heat became a serious problem, put on whatever they had, and started the day. The Egyptian day was organized around one unavoidable fact. By midday, the sun would be trying to kill you. Fields, construction sites, markets, all of it ran on the same logic. You worked in the early hours when the air was still bearable, and then you stopped. A midday siesta was built into the Egyptian working day the way the flood season was built into the farming calendar, not as a luxury, not as a cultural quirk, but as basic engineering. Work through the worst heat and you collapsed or died, neither of which were useful outcomes. So Egypt rested in the middle of the day, then picked up again in the late afternoon until dark. But before any of that, you had to get dressed. Linen, that was it. The answer to clothing in ancient Egypt, for every class, every gender, every occasion, from fieldwork to funeral rites. Linen came from flax grown along the Nile, and it was the only fabric that made real sense in that climate. Lightweight, breathable, and weavable into something so fine that the highest quality Egyptian linen was practically translucent. For men doing physical work, the standard was a loincloth or short kilt, wrapped and tied at the waist and reaching roughly to the knee. For women, a sheath dress called the calasiris, fitted close, held up by shoulder straps, leaving arms and lower legs free. Children often wore nothing at all until they were older, which in an Egyptian summer was not a deprivation. The quality of your linen told everyone exactly where you stood. Peasant cloth was coarse and undyed, rough against skin that already had enough problems from sun and river silt. Wealthier Egyptians wore linen more finely woven, sometimes pleated, sometimes dyed in subtle colors for festivals and formal occasions. The gap wasn't just aesthetic, it was immediately legible to anyone you passed in the street. Egypt didn't need name tags. Then comes the part that surprises most people. Everyone wore makeup. Both men and women across every level of society lined their eyes with kohl. Ground dark minerals applied with a small stick along the upper and lower lids. The result was the wide-eyed look visible in every surviving piece of Egyptian art. What most people don't expect is the reason. Vanity was certainly part of it, but kohl also cut the glare from sun reflecting off sand and water, the same principle behind the black strips modern athletes paint under their eyes. It also had genuine antimicrobial properties. Lead-based compounds in kohl formulations appear to have stimulated immune responses that reduced the rate of eye infection. In a country where flies were constant and river water touched everything, that was not a minor benefit. The Egyptians may not have known the chemistry behind it. They knew it worked. Jewelry was not optional, not if you could help it. Rings, bracelets, broad collar necklaces that draped across the chest and shoulders. The wesek, some spanning from collarbone to sternum, heavy with faience beads and gold. Anklets, earrings, finger rings stacked together. Almost every Egyptian wore something, and the something was chosen partly for protection rather than appearance alone. Amulets shaped like the Eye of Horus, scarab beetles, small figures of protective deities. These weren't decoration, they were technology. The belief that the right object, worn correctly, could deflect misfortune or illness wasn't superstition to the Egyptians. It was a rational response to a world full of things that could kill you without warning. The same amulets worn in life were wrapped into the linen bindings of mummies to do the same job on the other side. Hygiene was practiced daily and taken seriously. The Nile provided. People bathed in the river or in clay basins filled from it every morning as a matter of course. There was no soap, that came later, but a cleansing paste of oil, lime, and perfume was rubbed across the skin and rinsed off. Hair was another problem entirely. Lice were endemic in any crowded ancient settlement, and the Egyptians had a practical response. Shave it all off. Shaved heads were common, especially for children, and many adults wore wigs for public life instead of maintaining natural hair that would become a constant battleground with insects. Wigs could be cleaned, scalps could be oiled. The system was, in its own way, fairly elegant. What all of this added up to, the linen, the kohl, the amulets, the morning bathing ritual, was something more than personal hygiene or fashion. Cleanliness and correct presentation were tangled up with religious standing in ways that made the two essentially inseparable. To appear correctly was to be in alignment with Ma'at, the cosmic order that Egyptian theology placed at the center of everything. Dirty, unkempt, improperly dressed didn't just mean poor. It signaled spiritual disorder. Looking right was part of living right, and living right was what kept the universe from going wrong. By the time the sun cleared the horizon and the real heat began to build, the average Egyptian had already bathed, dressed, applied their kohl, and put on whatever amulets they owned. Then came the first meal of the day, which for most people in ancient Egypt was the same as the last meal and the one before that, and every meal they could remember. Not because they were starving, though sometimes they were, but because the Egyptian diet for ordinary people was built on two things above almost everything else: bread and beer. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley, baked every single day because it went stale fast and there was no other option. Beer brewed from barley, thick and cloudy by modern standards, drunk by everyone from laborers to children, because the alternative, drinking directly from the Nile, was a reliable way to get very sick and die young. Fermentation killed enough of what lived in the water to make beer genuinely safer. This wasn't a civilization of drinkers, it was a civilization that had solved a public health problem and happened to enjoy the solution. The bread came in different shapes and sizes, and sometimes when the harvest had been good and there was honey or dates to spare, it was sweetened. Usually it wasn't. Usually it was bread, flat or round, or formed into small loaves, baked in a clay oven or over an open fire, seasoned with nothing, eaten at every meal without significant variation. The Nile Delta could produce enough grain to feed enormous numbers of people, and it did reliably for millennia. What it produced was mostly grain, and so grain was mostly what people ate. Alongside the bread, onions, garlic, leeks, figs and dates when they were in season, lentils, a jar of beer on the table, always, and perhaps some water if you trusted where it came from that morning. Meat was a different story entirely. There simply wasn't much of it. The Nile Valley had limited grazing land. Cattle required space and water that Egypt's geography didn't generously provide. Livestock existed, but it was expensive to maintain, which made it expensive to eat. For the ordinary farming family, meat appeared at festivals, at weddings, at funerals, occasions where its presence marked something. On a regular Tuesday in a Nile Delta village, the table held bread and vegetables and not much else. The elite naturally ate differently. Wealthy households consumed roasted waterfowl hunted from the marshy edges of the delta, river fish prepared in ways that suggested real culinary ambition, honey-glazed meats, and elaborate baked preparations that required dedicated kitchen staff to execute. Wine, pressed from vineyards in the delta and in oases to the west, appeared on wealthy tables, a significant luxury in a country where most people drank beer their entire lives. The gap between what a scribe's family ate and what a field laborer's family ate was not subtle. It was the distance between a feast and subsistence, and both parties understood that completely. There was one thing the bread did to everyone, though, rich and poor alike. It destroyed their teeth. Egyptian grain was ground between stone mills, and no matter how careful the grinding, fine particles of sand and grit ended up in the flour. Eat bread every day for 40 years, which is what most Egyptians did, and those particles slowly wore the enamel off your teeth until the inner layers were exposed, abscessed, and infected. Mummies excavated across thousands of years of Egyptian history show the same pattern. Severe dental wear beginning in early adulthood, abscesses visible in the jawbone, tooth loss progressing steadily with age. For some individuals, dental infections appear to have been a direct cause of death. The most productive agricultural civilization in the ancient world built its diet on a grain supply that slowly destroyed the mouths of everyone who ate it. Cooking happened over open fires or in clay ovens built into the corners of homes or courtyards, simple structures that trapped and concentrated heat well enough to bake bread and boil lentils. Seasoning was coriander and cumin, primarily, with salt available from the desert and garlic adding flavor to almost everything. The food smelled good. The techniques were not complicated, but they weren't careless either. Bread recipes in Egypt had real variety, fermentation was understood and controlled, and the management of grain stores required genuine skill. Women did most of the cooking, organized the household food supply, and kept accurate track of what was available and what wasn't. In a world where the difference between a full granary and an empty one could be life and death, that knowledge carried real weight. The Nile made this diet possible. The same floods that threatened to wash away mud brick homes left behind the black silt that made the grain grow. Egypt fed itself from a narrow strip of land running along both sides of the river, surrounded on all sides by desert that produced nothing. The margin was not comfortable. When the flood came too high, it drowned the fields. When it came too low, the harvest shrank and the bread got smaller and the beer got weaker and the people got hungry. Most years, it worked. Most years was enough to sustain a civilization for 3,000 years. But it required everyone to work constantly at whatever the season demanded. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons, and if you farmed, which most people did, all 3 owned you completely. Akhet was the inundation, roughly our July through October, when the Nile rose and swallowed the fields under a spreading brown flood. Nothing to plant, nothing to tend. The fields were simply gone. Pare followed, the growing season, when the water pulled back and left behind dense black silt that made Egyptian soil some of the most productive on earth. Seeds went in, crops came up with something close to reliable consistency, and the difference between a good growing season and a poor one was the difference between security and hunger. Then came Shemu, the harvest, brutal work in the worst heat of the year, cutting grain with wooden sickles, threshing, winnowing, loading and hauling to the granaries while calculating, always calculating, what portion would survive the tax collectors and what would remain to feed your family through the following year. Then the flood came again and the whole sequence restarted. 3,000 years, almost without variation. A good farmer didn't just know how to plant and cut grain. He needed to read the river. How high would the flood reach this year? Was it already receding or still rising? Had enough silt settled to plant early, or would the soil crack and harden before the seed could take? These weren't questions with obvious answers, and getting them wrong meant a bad harvest. And a bad harvest meant the thin margin your family lived on simply collapsed. The Nile was generous by any ancient agricultural standard. It was also absolutely ruthless to people who misread it. During Akhet, though, when the fields were underwater and there was nothing left to farm, the state had a ready solution for all that idled labor. You built things. The pyramids, the temples, the colossal quarried monuments that still dominate the landscape. These were not built by slaves. This is worth saying directly because the image of chained captives driven under whips has stayed lodged in popular imagination far longer than the evidence justifies. Excavations at Giza have exposed an entire purpose-built worker village at the base of the plateau, organized dormitories, industrial bakeries, breweries operating at significant scale, and a field hospital showing evidence of genuine medical care, healed bone fractures, treated amputations, injuries managed well enough that people survive them and return to work. Slaves don't get field hospitals. What the archaeological record shows is a conscripted labor force, farmers required by the state to contribute labor during flood season, roughly the way modern citizens pay taxes, organized, fed, compensated in food and beer, and medically attended when the work broke something. The men buried in the workers' cemetery near Giza show physically hard lives. They also show evidence of having been cared for. Those two things coexisted, and both are part of the real story. But pyramid construction was seasonal and not universal. Most people spent most of their working lives within the occupation they were born into, and the single biggest factor in which occupation that was happened to be which family you were born into. At the top of the non-royal labor hierarchy sat the scribes, and the distance between a literate Egyptian and an illiterate one was not a small step. It was a different economic universe entirely. Fewer than 5% of the population could read and write. In a civilization built on recorded information, tax assessments, grain inventories, legal contracts, land surveys, royal decrees, religious texts, controlling that information was controlling how reality worked. Scribes certified the official version of events. They recorded what you owed and what you'd paid. A man who could read didn't just have a skill, he had leverage over everyone who couldn't, which was almost everyone. Below the scribes, a wide band of craftsmen and artisans occupied the practical middle of Egyptian society. Potters, carpenters, weavers, jewelers, stone carvers, painters who covered tomb walls with imagery we now recognize as distinctly and unmistakably Egyptian. These were inherited trades, passed down through families, the knowledge moving from father to son across generations without much interruption. Merchants worked the Nile and the overland routes, trading grain and linen for copper from Sinai and cedar from Lebanon. Soldiers received food rations and could earn land grants for distinguished service, one of the few routes upward that didn't require the ability to read. Connecting all of it was a tax system built entirely on grain. Egypt had no coined currency for most of its long history. The state's revenues were measured in wheat and barley, assessed against each farm's expected yield, collected after harvest, stored in state granaries, and then redistributed outward as wages to state workers, rations to the military, offerings maintained for temple priests. The whole economy was, at its core, a grain management operation running at enormous scale. When the system functioned, it was impressively stable. When the Nile ran too low for consecutive years and the harvest shrank, the entire structure came under strain. Tax records from lean periods show shortfalls, delayed wages, reduced rations. The monuments look eternal. The system that built them was always balanced on a thin agricultural edge. Through all of it, the midday siesta remained non-negotiable. Around noon, when temperatures could reach 40 degrees and beyond, work stopped. People found shade, a wall, a palm tree, the interior of whatever structure was nearest, drank beer, ate what they had, and waited out the worst heat before resuming in the afternoon until dark. It was not laziness, it was engineering, and through all the farming and building and trade and hauling and tax accounting, the work was never purely secular. The farmer said prayers over the seed. The craftsman shaping an object understood it as simultaneously practical and sacred. Labor and devotion were not different activities pointing in different directions. In Egypt, they were the same direction. Egyptian families were large by design. Infant mortality was not a background statistic in the ancient world. It was a daily reality that shaped every decision around family structure. Children died from infections, from fevers, from accidents along the Nile, from the ordinary cascade of childhood illness that modern medicine has mostly eliminated. The response was straightforward: have more children. The expectation that some would not survive was built into family planning the way flood season was built into the agricultural calendar, not with resignation exactly, but with clear eyes about the odds. The children who survived early childhood seem, by the archaeological evidence, to have had actual childhoods. Toys appear consistently in excavated Egyptian settlements across every period: small clay dolls with beaded hair, wooden animals with movable limbs, leather balls, spinning tops. These weren't ritual objects, though some ended up in tombs. They were played with, worn down, left in corners. The evidence of use is unmistakable. Children in ancient Egypt played, and the adults around them apparently thought this was reasonable. The Nile was the playground. Most Egyptians lived close enough to the river that children swam in it regularly. Fishing with harpoons was often a family activity rather than a specialist trade. Young children tagged along, older ones helped, and the line between play and useful contribution blurred the way it does in families that can't afford the distinction. Then there was Senet, one of the oldest board games on Earth, with examples dating to around 3100 BCE, played across every social class for the full span of Egyptian civilization. The board had 30 squares in 3 rows of 10. Players moved pieces using throwing sticks or early dice, trying to advance off the board before their opponent. Simple enough in structure, but Senet was not just a game, and the Egyptians were explicit about this. The board was a map of the underworld. Moving your pieces from one end to the other mirrored the soul's journey through the realm of the dead toward eternal life. Certain squares offered safe passage, others trapped you, gates guarded by the divine bureaucracy of the dead, where the wrong move cost you everything. Winning wasn't purely satisfying in the way a board game victory is satisfying. You had navigated the underworld and come through. Pharaohs were buried with Senet boards. Ordinary workers played it in the shade during the midday rest. Both took it seriously in their own way. Childhood itself ended quickly. Boys began learning their father's trade as soon as they were physically useful, which was earlier than modern sensibilities are comfortable with. A farmer's son was in the field by the time he could handle a tool. A potter's son shaped clay beside his father. A carpenter's son learned by watching, then by doing, then by being trusted with work that mattered. This wasn't exploitation in the sense the word carries now. It was how knowledge crossed generations in a society where formal education reached almost nobody. Girls learned from their mothers, cooking, weaving, managing the household food stores, tracking what the family needed against what it had. In a subsistence economy, the woman who understood the family's grain supply, when to trade and when to hold back, was making decisions with genuine stakes. These weren't minor domestic details. They were the difference between a household that ate through winter and one that didn't. Formal schooling existed, but narrowly. Scribal schools trained the sons of wealthy men and officials to read, write, and calculate. A handful of girls from elite families received some literacy education, though this was rare and understood as exceptional. For the vast majority of Egyptian children, education meant standing beside a parent and watching carefully until they could do it themselves. Marriage arrived before what we'd consider adulthood. Girls were typically married around 12 and boys around 15, with parents arranging the match. The logic was practical. Households needed labor, family alliances had real value, and beginning young gave more years for children to arrive. Romantic love features in Egyptian poetry and was presumably felt, but it wasn't the organizing principle. What Egyptian marriage actually was, legally, was a property arrangement with specific terms. Each partner controlled what they brought into the union. Assets built during the marriage were held jointly. The groom's family gave a gift to the bride's family. Divorce was available to both partners and wasn't particularly uncommon. If the marriage ended, the woman left with what she had originally brought plus a share of the joint property, somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 depending on circumstances and who had initiated the split. If the husband left, he could be held financially liable in ways that look recognizable today. The deeper point is what Egyptian women could do entirely independent of marriage: own land, inherit property, initiate legal proceedings, testify in court, disinherit ungrateful children, which required having genuine legal authority over your estate in the first place. These weren't theoretical rights stored in texts and never exercised. They appear in actual legal documents across the entire history of the civilization. Greek women had almost none of this. Roman women had slightly more, but still largely required male guardians to act on their behalf. Women in ancient Egypt had a legal standing that most of their contemporaries across the ancient Mediterranean world simply didn't, which creates a strange picture. A civilization that offered women meaningful legal personhood, built on the labor of peasants who owned almost nothing, controlled almost nothing, and made up roughly 80% of the entire population. The rights existed, so did the inequality, and in ancient Egypt, as in most places, neither one canceled the other out. Egyptian religion wasn't something you practiced on certain days and set aside on others. There was no setting it aside. It ran underneath everything: the agricultural calendar, the tax system, the legal framework, the medicine, the architecture. Separating religion from daily life in ancient Egypt is like trying to separate water from the Nile. The categories don't actually exist independently. At the center of all of it was Ma'at, not simply a goddess, though she was that, a woman with an ostrich feather in her headdress appearing in tomb paintings across 3,000 years of Egyptian art. Ma'at was also a concept, a daily moral obligation carried by every Egyptian from pharaoh to field worker. She embodied truth, order, cosmic balance. The sun rising, the Nile flooding at the right level, the crops growing. These were not simply natural events to the Egyptian mind. They were symptoms of a universe in order, and that order required active maintenance. Individual human behavior was part of that maintenance. This wasn't metaphor, and the Egyptians didn't treat it as metaphor. If people acted dishonestly, without proper regard for obligations owed to gods and family and community, the cosmic order deteriorated. Not symbolically, actually, the sun could fail to rise. The flood could fail to come. The world could slide into chaos, isfet in the Egyptian vocabulary, a state of disorder so fundamental it threatened existence itself. The idea that your personal choices had cosmological consequences wasn't a comforting spiritual frame. It was a serious claim about how reality worked. Living in alignment with Ma'at meant something concrete. Justice in your dealings, truth in your speech, proper care for aging parents. The obligations appeared in texts like the negative confessions, where the dead declared before the divine court everything they had not done. I have not caused suffering, I have not cheated anyone of their land, I have not treated anyone with contempt. Each statement was simultaneously a legal claim and a spiritual one, because in Egypt, those were the same thing. The great state temples, massive complexes where priests perform rituals 3 times daily to maintain the god's presence in the physical world, were not where most Egyptians connected with the divine. Ordinary people weren't permitted in the inner sanctuaries. The rituals were performed on behalf of everyone, but not by everyone. The distance between a field laborer and the inner sanctum of Karnak was enormous. What ordinary Egyptians had instead were household shrines. Excavations at Deir el-Medina, the village built to house the workers who cut the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, produced intimate evidence of daily Egyptian religious life. Homes there contained niches in the walls, small recessed spaces with painted images of personal deities, household gods, portraits of deceased relatives whose spirits remained, in Egyptian theology, connected to the family. These weren't decorations, they were functional altars, offerings of food or flowers, prayers spoken in the plain domestic voice that formal temple liturgy didn't accommodate. 2 deities appeared in these domestic shrines more than almost any other. Best looked like nothing you'd expect from a protective god. A dwarf with a lion's mane, a grimacing face, a tongue thrust out toward whatever threatened the household. Deliberately ugly, the appearance was part of the function. He guarded children, deflected evil from the home, stood watch over the vulnerable parts of domestic life. His image appeared on furniture and bedroom walls, particularly where women gave birth. Taweret was a hippopotamus standing upright, pregnant herself, with a crocodile tail and a lion's limbs. She governed pregnancy and childbirth, and in a world where childbirth killed women with terrible regularity, her domain was among the most important a deity could hold. Both look alarming. Both were beloved across the full range of Egyptian society, from palace to mud brick village, for the entire known span of the civilization. The Egyptians understood that what protects you doesn't have to look safe. Beyond the household, religion organized the public calendar in ways that marked time for everyone, regardless of class. The Apet festival, celebrated during flood season when the fields were underwater and agricultural labor had temporarily stalled, lasted up to 4 weeks. The divine statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in processions from Karnak to Luxor through crowds of thousands. The gods were moving through the streets, visible, accessible among the people. Petitions could be addressed directly to the procession. Oracles answered questions. People who needed a legal dispute settled or clarity on a decision they couldn't make alone brought their cases to the moving statues and received responses through the movements of the priests carrying them. The whole community attended. Wealthy families, craftsmen, field laborers, soldiers, children. The religion that operated at the level of cosmic order also operated at the level of daily practical need. And the festivals were where those 2 things met in public. Religion was the calendar. It explained why the flood came and what to do when it didn't. It governed medicine. Illness was a physical problem and a spiritual one simultaneously, and treatment addressed both. It was woven into inheritance law, agricultural timing, architectural orientation. It told you what to say before the first meal of the day and how to treat the dead, who were still, in a meaningful sense, present. The gods were not optional. They were in the niche in the wall, in the amulet on your wrist, in the festival that temporarily suspended the ordinary labor of your life and reminded you what the whole structure was for. The Egyptian relationship with death was not morbid, it was administrative. Death, in the Egyptian framework, wasn't an ending so much as a transition requiring careful preparation. The way a long journey requires a visa, the right currency, and a working knowledge of local customs. Get those things right, and the destination was extraordinary. Get them wrong, and the consequences were permanent in a way that made ordinary earthly failure look minor by comparison. The soul, in Egyptian theology, was not a single thing. It had components. The Ka was the life force, the animating energy created at birth, the part of you that needed to be sustained after you died. The Bay was something closer to personality or individual identity, a spirit that could move freely between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, depicted in art as a human-headed bird hovering near the body. Both the Ka and the Ba needed to return to the physical body to rest, to be refreshed, to continue existing, which meant the body needed to still exist, which meant preservation wasn't optional. It was a theological requirement, hence mummification. The full process took 70 days and was, for the wealthy, extraordinarily elaborate. The body was brought to the embalming tent. The brain was extracted through the nostrils using a long hook. The Egyptians did not regard the brain as particularly important, so it was discarded. The organs that mattered were removed through an incision in the left side. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, each cleaned and wrapped and placed in individual canopic jars stoppered with carved lids depicting the 4 sons of Horus. The heart was left in the chest. It would be needed later. Then the body was packed in natron, a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds across Egypt, and left to desiccate for 40 days. Natron drew out moisture, collapsed the bacteria that caused decay, and left behind a desiccated form that could, with correct treatment, last indefinitely. After 40 days, the body was stuffed with linen and sawdust to restore its shape, coated in oils and resins, and wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages. Amulets were layered between the bindings at specific points, protection for specific vulnerabilities on the journey ahead. The whole process required specialists who spent their entire careers doing exactly this, employed by temples with dedicated embalming facilities. For ordinary Egyptians, the expensive version was not available. Simpler preparations existed: basic preservation, minimal materials, burial in dry desert sand that often preserved bodies naturally through desiccation alone. The theology applied equally to everyone. The practical execution was scaled to what you could afford. The tomb was not simply a burial site, it was a residence. For the wealthy, tomb construction began during life and continued for decades. The walls were covered with painted scenes, agriculture, hunting, banquets, domestic activities that served simultaneously as decoration and magical provision. If you painted a feast on the wall, the food would be available to the deceased eternally. If you painted a field being harvested, the grain would sustain the K forever. The paintings weren't illustrative, they were functional. Inside the tomb went actual food, jars of wine and beer, furniture, jewelry, tools relevant to the deceased's occupation, clothing, everything the person had needed in life, they would apparently need again. The logic was consistent with the broader Egyptian view of the afterlife as a world mirroring this one. The same activities, the same social structure, the same daily requirements, just running on the other side of the boundary. But the work of the afterlife was still work, and nobody wanted to do it. So into the tomb went ushaptis, small mummiform figurines, sometimes hundreds of them, each inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead. If the deceased was called upon to perform labor in the afterlife, agricultural work, construction, whatever the divine administration might require, an ushapti would answer in their place. The word means roughly one who answers. Wealthy Egyptians were buried with enough ushaptis to cover every day of the year, plus supervisors to manage them. Even in eternity, the social hierarchy held. The Book of the Dead itself, more accurately a collection of individual spells assembled into a personalized compilation, was included in the tomb as a practical manual. It mapped the geography of the underworld, named the gatekeepers and divine officials the soul would encounter, and provided the correct spells and declarations needed to pass each checkpoint. Getting these right wasn't ceremonial. It was literally the difference between making it through and failing somewhere in the dark with no way forward. At the final checkpoint came the weighing of the heart. The heart, repository of conscience, memory, moral record, was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at. The feather weighed almost nothing. If the heart balanced it, the soul passed and entered eternal life. If the heart was heavy, burdened with dishonesty, cruelty, violations of the obligations that held the social and cosmic order together, the scale tipped and Ammit was waiting, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, three of the most dangerous animals in the Egyptian world fused into one. Ammit's function was specific. She consumed the hearts that failed the weighing. And when the heart was gone, so was everything. Not punishment in the sense of suffering, not fire, not torment, not a dark mirror of living existence. Simply cessation. The soul stopped being. All memory of it dissolved. Every person this person had ever been, everything they had built or loved or known, ended completely and without remainder. The Egyptians called this the second death, and they regarded it as the most terrible outcome conceivable, which means that every ethical decision an Egyptian made, every transaction, every judgment, every moment of choosing whether to act fairly or not, was being recorded, not by a priest or a state official. It was recorded in the substance of the heart itself, accumulating, building, forming the actual physical evidence that would be weighed after death. The afterlife wasn't a vague hope. It was a destination with a strict admissions process, and you spent your entire life building your application. Egyptian physicians were famous, not just within Egypt, genuinely famous across the ancient world. Foreign kings wrote to the pharaoh requesting specific doctors by name, the way wealthy patients today seek out particular surgeons. Persian rulers wanted Egyptian physicians. Hittite kings requested them. The reputation was earned, and the evidence for why survives in physical documents. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but probably copied from older texts, is one of the most striking medical documents from the ancient world. It describes 48 surgical cases in clinical detail, head injuries, spinal trauma, broken bones, infected wounds, with observations and recommendations that are recognizably diagnostic in structure. The physician examines the patient, records findings, and assesses whether the case is treatable or beyond help entirely. For skull fractures, the text describes the brain pulsating through damaged bone and notes that neurological symptoms follow injuries to specific parts of the head. They understood the brain controlled the body. In 1600 BCE, they set broken bones with splints and bandaging that modern surgeons would recognize as sensible. Wounds were sutured. Honey was used as an antimicrobial agent, something modern research has confirmed genuinely works. They prescribed willow bark for pain and inflammation, and willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Some of what Egyptian medicine prescribed worked, and it worked for reasons the Egyptians couldn't have explained in modern terms, but had identified through careful observation over a very long time. The complication is that none of this existed separately from magic. Not as a contradiction, as a coherent system. Illness was simultaneously a physical and a spiritual problem, and treating only the physical dimension was, from the Egyptian perspective, incomplete. A physician approaching a patient brought herbs and surgical skill and also prayers and incantations directed at the relevant deity. Certain ailments belonged to certain gods. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and destruction, also governed plague and epidemic disease. She could send illness across an entire region, and she could withdraw it. Treating a serious fever without addressing Sekhmet was, in Egyptian medical logic, working on the wrong level entirely. Treatment was therefore layered, the practical and the supernatural applied together, because separating them didn't fit the framework Egyptians used to understand how bodies and the world interacted. Some of what came out of this system worked. Some was neutral, some was dangerous. Animal dung appears in Egyptian medical texts as an ingredient in various preparations, applied to wounds, mixed into remedies for specific complaints. The reasoning involved symbolic and magical properties. The practical result was introducing bacteria directly into injuries already trying to heal. Patients who survived the original problem sometimes died from the treatment. This wasn't unique to Egypt. Ancient medicine everywhere struggled to distinguish observation-based practice from inherited remedies that had never been tested against outcomes. But the dung preparations stand as the most direct example of where the Egyptian system could turn lethal. Dentistry occupied a particularly grim corner. By middle age, most Egyptians were dealing with the consequences: exposed nerve tissue, abscesses forming in the jaw, bone infections that spread upward into the skull. Treatments were limited: extraction where possible, drainage of abscesses, topical preparations of uncertain value. No anesthesia beyond what strong drink and prayers could approximate. Dental infections that went untreated long enough spread into the bloodstream and killed people who had otherwise survived farming accidents and decades of hard labor without serious injury. The mummies confirmed this pattern relentlessly, from royal burials to worker graves. Childbirth carried its own sustained danger. Women gave birth at home with midwives attending, surrounded by prayers to Taweret and Bes and whatever else could be called on. Magic and medicine operated together here. Specific spells to speed a difficult delivery, amulets placed near the laboring woman, remedies prepared from plants whose properties the papyri describe in careful detail. The understanding of physiology was incomplete, the tools for intervention limited, and infections following complicated deliveries were frequently fatal. Maternal mortality was consistent enough that it shaped household religion. Protective deities of childbirth appear in domestic shrines across every social class precisely because the need for them was so real. Life expectancy at birth ran roughly 35 to 40 years, largely because infant and child mortality dragged the average down sharply. Those who survived childhood could realistically expect considerably more. People in their 50s and 60s appear throughout the historical record, and some live past 70. Rameses II ruled for 66 years and died in his 90s. But reaching old age was uncommon, and old age in a body worn down by decades of agricultural labor, grit-filled bread, and the medicine of 3,000 years ago was not a comfortable arrival. Here is what all of it amounts to: a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, longer than the gap between us and ancient Rome, longer than Christianity has existed. It fed millions of people from a narrow ribbon of farmable land surrounded by desert. It built structures so precisely engineered that modern engineers still study the geometry. And the people who kept all of this running woke up every morning with the same small and urgent concerns: enough food for the year ahead, healthy children making it through, fair treatment in this life, and something like justice in the next. The monuments outlasted everyone who built them. The worries of the people who built them never changed at all. That's the thing about Egypt that keeps pulling people back. Not the gold or the scale, but the recognition. Underneath 3,000 years of recorded human life is the same short list of things people have always needed and never stopped fearing losing. Feed your family, keep your children alive, die having done more good than harm, not reassuring exactly, but continuous. If this is the kind of history that holds your attention, subscribing is how you see what comes next.